This is The Breakup Theory, conversations on ending things and collective liberation. On today's show, I talked with one of my favorite people, Jamie Theophilos, a dear friend and comrade. Jamie teaches and studies the politics of digital technology and is a longtime organizer and anarchist, as well as video editor, videographer, graphic designer, and motion graphics artist. Jamie has an essay, Ways of Seeing Radical Queerness, in the book I co-edited, Surviving the Future, Abolitionist Queer Strategies, with PM Press. Go check out that essay. Jamie and I planned today's conversation around an essay that Jamie shared with me called Rethinking Repair by Stephen J. Jackson, coming from the academic field of science and technology studies. I'll link the essay in the show notes if you want to read it. Jamie knew that I had been working on a project around anarchism and breaking up, and this essay proposes a theory of relation specifically to technology through the idea of breakdown, which emphasizes care and repair. Our conversation tries to use this perspective to interrogate our relationship to the technology that plays a large role in our lives, and which can seem so totalizing and nefarious. How do we relate to the tools we have to create spaces for our flourishing and solidarity right now? We try to move through these questions without having any kind of purist response or binary thinking. I hope you enjoy the conversation. You can support and follow us on Patreon at The Breakup Theory. There's an option to subscribe for $5, which helps me keep on doing this work. You can also follow us and rate us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks to everyone who's reached out to share your thoughts and ideas. Also, remember, dear listeners, our phone lines are open at 917-426-6548, and our encrypted submission form is still live at forum.jotform.com/thebreakuptheory/stories. We'll be recording regular episodes that discuss the stories and questions and conflicts that you share with us to give a breakup theory and queer anarchist perspective on our relationships and how we're living our lives. Please share anything you like. We'll only discuss what you say is okay on air. Look forward to the next episode of Breakup Theory's Agony Ants. So we planned to have this conversation to discuss this idea of broken world thinking and the ideas of breakdown around technology and anarchism. So as a way to start our conversation, James, do you think you could give us... Oh, wait, hold on. Do you want me to call you James or Jamie? Because I know you're using Jamie in your...
Use Jamie for... That's kind of what I'm doing more professionally.
Okay.
It's also not my dead name anyways. Like, I'm okay with people calling me Jamie. But yeah, if you like fumble at any point, it doesn't matter. If you like say James, I'm okay with that too, but I'll probably have you have like Jamie Theophilos when you like promote it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll start again. So we wanted to have this conversation to talk about this idea of broken world thinking, which comes out of technology studies, and thinking about how this could connect to approaches to the world, and also thinking about technology. So as a way to get started, Jamie, do you think you could ground us in the ideas of broken world thinking?
Yeah. The concept of looking at repair and the repair of technologies, or even like caring of artifacts and things, has been a framework of thought that's existed within science and technology studies, as well as kind of this tangential feminist technology, science and technology studies. So I guess some little background on like STS, as it's like referred to, is that STS kind of grew as a response to traditional sociology and traditional like mainstream like science, very quantitative mainstream ideas of technology that see technology as something separate from how we socialize and engage in the world. So STS is really looking at the fact that technology is a social construct that's like influenced by people's ideologies, ways of engaging in it. There's also a lot of different, now at this point, there's a lot of different ways people have argued even within that. Yeah, there's just lots of different ways that people have now kind of interpreted this idea of understanding technology as something socially constructed. But it's been kind of the work of that has been pretty influential to me. And what came about is essentially I went to one of your workshops in September on the idea of breakup theory. And we've been talking about that. I've been thinking about it. I've been thinking about my own experiences after going to your workshop, and even before, thinking about my own experience with my own breakups and relationships and ways I'm trying to get better. So that definitely was how I kind of first understood what you were talking about. And obviously, it seems like from what we've learned, that's what I've been learning, is that that's also kind of how you came to this framework. But I came across this article that I read, Rethinking Repair by Stephen Jackson. And in this article, in this essay, they talk about how this is about developing this idea of a broken world thinking. One of the big things about people who have studied technology is that often when we've created this history of technology, we really focus on the successors, like people who accomplished something, who created this innovative thing that has transformed the world. And we've not put many attention, or there's really, really such little literature and people who have studied technology that failed, like technology that fails, or even technologies that break down, they decay, or the politics of how you have to maintain a technology. That's another big one too. What Jackson talks about when he's creating this idea of broken world thinking is he wants to push towards how we can appreciate the limits and sense of fragility that the world creates and inhabits, whether it's natural, social, technological. And what he kind of says, just to exactly quote it, is he wants to recognize that the stories and orders of kind of modernity, or whatever we want to call the past couple hundred years, are in process of falling apart and replaced by new and different stories and orders, or they might not be. And he kind of encourages to think of how could we look at history from a perspective of seeing things as breaking down? How would that create kind of an alternative history?
I think that's helpful. And the way that you were talking about sort of the social construction of technology, I think is a good way of thinking about it, because one way that we relate to technology is the idea that it's this tool that we just use and it doesn't change us. We just can use it externally to get the things we need done. But I guess this theory is thinking also about how the technology kind of changes us in our use of it. And so that's something maybe we want to talk about also, particularly because I know one of the, maybe later in the conversation, one of your interests is around also corporate social media and surveillance capitalism. But just thinking about this tool thing, it also makes me think of the kind of Heideggerian reading of the tool, where you have a tool that's ready at hand and it goes seamlessly into your functioning. But when it breaks down is when you sort of understand the beingness of the tool, or something. That I think he talks about this too, language. We understand that the way language works through communication breakdowns. So I think that's sort of an interesting way to change our perspective. And for me, the way that I talk about anarchism is often just it's using the same things that we have at hand, but reframing our perspective on things so that we're not looking through a state logic or through the logic of the market or top-down hierarchical.
Yeah.
I read this essay too, and one of the main images that he uses in the essay is how these big ships that are not being used anymore will end up on shore. I think it's in India, and and then people will take the ship apart and then repurpose all the parts of it for other things. And that's an untold history. And he's this history could go on, back to all the history of ships that at some point the ships get reused for other things. And I think that's just interesting to think about this kind of afterlives of all these products, because mostly we are imagining everything in this kind of commodity culture that we use something up and then throw it out.
Yeah,
and a lot of the new technology is designed so that we don't have access to the possibility of repair. That's the whole Apple thing, right?
Yeah, that's what I remember that was a big thing that I had mentioned or was really thinking about when I was reading this article, and times we were talking in the past, is there is this movement that's called the right to repair movement. And it's this idea that we as users, as individuals, should have more agency for how we can repair our technologies. So a great example of that is that for anyone who's maybe familiar or owns an Apple computer, which I think a lot of people do, there is major barriers to how you can actually repair or take apart or rebuild their computers. For instance, I wanted to add more RAM to my computer, and I realized that the version, and I have a desktop, a Mac desktop, and I realized that I actually couldn't. Not only would I not be able to do it personally, which I was interested in doing, but they literally could. How the technology was designed is that not only were you only able to get it fixed if it was by a Mac specialist and Apple specialist, but that when I brought it in, finally, they were like, we actually can't even add more. This is your computer can't do that. And I do think that has that has massive political implications in a lot of ways. And it goes into this other idea that kind of came out of STS research and theory called the black box. And the idea of the black box is that how technology has formed is that something goes into it. We input something and then it comes out with something else. And we don't really know as users what's happening in between, but we use it all the time. Even someone such as myself who's very interested in technology, I know very little about how when I put something into my iPhone, whether I send a text message, I type out something, I record something on my phone, what is actually happening from like here to there, right? And that idea of us having to rely on like large corporations who are continuously kind of pushing for us to use their products as a way to have things be more seamless, have things be more easy to use, you can be more productive, the easier and more seamless things are. Also, the less we know about how these things are actually happening. We don't know how their algorithms work, or we don't know how they've created these hardware systems, these SIM cards. What are the environmental components? How are they creating those things? Where are they mining the lithium? And the more that we have to rely on these technologies, kind of the less we provide opportunities to even learn what is happening. We become kind of desensitized to these things, and it really contributes to very invisible power structures. And I think that is really well suited to so much of what anarchism provides, which is thinking about how we can interrogate and bring awareness to things that people often aren't being pushed to think about, or that we within education, or lots of other ways haven't thought about enough.
Yeah, and so like there's power at play in the way that these things are made. And it's interesting because one of the things that around how this works, like with that black box theory and the way that I was talking about how that kind of tools sort of seamlessly enter our lives, like the way that this stuff works so well is because we adapt to it so quickly. So like I've lived in a time where I didn't have a cell phone with me at all times, but like it's like kind of unthinkable now to imagine that world, even though I used to like meet people, be like, we're going to meet at this place at this time, and we couldn't be in contact that whole time before that, And so we like integrate this stuff into our lives so quickly and without really often reflection on how it changes us. And this is something I've actually been thinking about a lot just personally, like I can date since I got an iPhone or smartphone that my life has gotten worse. But
yeah, big time.
Especially after the beginning of COVID and like the isolation of that, I've gotten so connected to my phone that I feel like my whole existence has changed in a way that I find terrible. Mm-hmm. But so the power system there is like that they take away the possibility of us understanding how these things work and then integrate it into our life so that we're sort of dependent on it for so many different things. But like there was a time where like certain kinds of technologies where you would be able to tinker with and change, right? Like there's a DIY component. Like, I don't know, you can see it in cars really well too. Like cars used to be like mostly mechanical, and so you could learn how to work on cars. But now they've integrated more and more kind of computer stuff and proprietary technology. This is another aspect of it, right? The intellectual property component that like, they don't want us to use things or know how to do things because they can make money off owning that thing.
Yeah.
So it just removes our possibility of learning how to repair, of making modifications. And I think if we like go to Apple too, the kind of aesthetics of it seems important because like they design it in such a way that it can be so integrated into our lives that we like want it to. I guess I'm just kind of repeating some of the same things, but thinking about it as a structure of power.
Totally. This is a thing I really like that he says that is kind of he's just saying it very succinctly, which is that, these forms of oppressive regimes and institutions and kind of these systemic infrastructures are often invisible until they break down, we force them to break down, or they break down in itself, without any form of visible resistance. And the more that these, like what he describes as the material world, as it more that those things resist, obstruct, that they frustrate people, that they decay, or they work in ways that we originally didn't intend them to, those type of actions call attention to itself. That we begin to learn these things from the ways that we become frustrated or stalled through how these technologies function. So I guess another thing that with STS, that's a really big component, is that, and what kind of Jackson is working off of is when he's looking at how social orders are maintained, or like how things break down, he's really trying to also make us look at how are they physically maintained. So let's think about the artifact of an iPhone, right? Or the infrastructure of the internet. How are these things maintained? How are they physically embodied, right? And then in that sense, how are they also broken? And they are broken through things such as ideas, physical actions, and like their usage. So I do really like the idea of us trying to interrogate, I think it's really easy for us to often think as anarchists to think about things like as systemic power in ways that are more esoteric, which are also obviously valuable, but that there are physical material manifestations of oppressive regimes and physical power. The internet is not something that just kind of exists in the air. There is physical cables that are running throughout the sea that make the World Wide Web function the way that it does. The other thing I think of is like, I guess within all of this, and I mentioned this earlier before, is that there is a vibrant history of anarchists and radicals working to break things down and within technology specifically, an example would be people who have been a part of the free open source software movement, people who are hackers who have really supported piracy, and there's a really, really vibrant history of that has existed for quite some time. These movements and these cultures are not perfect in a lot of ways. There's lots of issues with them, but it goes definitely into one of the ways that it's really hard to see these and intentionally break things down is through proprietary licensing. And I guess what I mean by proprietary is the idea that like things are privately owned, so that like with source code, for instance, on Zoom, right, which is what we're using right now, I don't have access to the code to create something like Zoom that might suit my needs better, right? Because they have blocked it because they've privatized their code. So the open source software movement does something different, or has tried to throughout its histories, that starting in the 80s, is trying to have code that allows people to create forked versions of software, of platforms, so that they can create and add things to it. They can take things apart. So I think that that's a very interesting thing. The sad thing about a lot of this is that we have become so backed into a wall for how we use these proprietary corporate mainstream softwares that a lot of people don't want to move or change to other free or open source software because it's not as easy to do. They out of like, oh, well, this is just more convenient. I can use a Gmail because I can just log in very quickly to lots of things. They've pushed a lot of us, almost all of us, back in, held us hostage into using their platforms. And what I think about and I'm interested in is that there's this politic to user friendliness. I think it's a very strategic move of capitalism that by really emphasizing and making things as easy as possible, as seamless, to centralize our data because it's just easy. It's everything's at your disposal right at one click. Right when we have them take our biometric data by looking at our face, we're easily logged in where we can get access to everything. And that anytime those things kind of break down, when we see data breaches, right, or we find out that how we've been using those, it's now being used for nefarious purposes, or we've had friends that have been doxxed or arrested due to facial recognition software and how we've been participating on things like Instagram or Facebook, that's these moments where we're suddenly like, oh crap, like what does it look like to use these platforms, right? But then suddenly it feels like finding any like alternatives would be too hard. It's too confusing, or we don't have access to the knowledge to learn. So I think that that's one of the unfortunate things about big tech and our monopolistic, neoliberal capitalism or capitalist system, is really looking at this politic of user friendliness and politic of being seamless, technology being seamless.
Yeah, there was a change, I guess, at some point, because to be able to use computers, you would have had to know how to code and build. I don't know. You would have to have some kind of specialized knowledge at some point, and then they kind of developed a personal computer that could be used by anyone. I mean, one of the things that's like interesting to me is that the sort of double-sidedness of it, that there's always this like utopian idea behind like technological development, right? Like I think all of the kind of automation fantasies that like if we automate things, then the utopian version is we would work less. But what actually happens is the automation actually allows more profit to go to the top and makes our lives immiserated. And
Hmm.
we see that with like the kind of development of the World Wide Web too, right? That like there was an idea that this would create a way to share all the information and knowledge
Yeah.
everywhere in the world, but through the sort of development of it is like around these kind of corporations like Apple and then Facebook and stuff. They've made it more of a profit making device,
Yeah.
but at some point we got integrated into it to such an extent that like we can't, it's hard for us to go back, right? Like to access so many things that you need in this world. At some point, like there's like a place you can't go back pre this technology, right? Like you
Yeah.
kind of need an email now to have a job, or like all of these different kinds of, I don't know, ways that we're sort of integrated into this technological world. It's
Hmm.
like, I mean, it's also like I'm thinking about this, as you were connecting it to kind of capitalism. Like the development of capitalism had to force a certain sector of the population into wage labor, right? Like it's a sort of story of removing people from the possibility of subsistence, of being able to recreate their own lives, and making them
Mm.
need to earn money through work in order to have food and shelter.
Yeah.
That's like a violent process of forcing people to work. And technology, I think the sort of technology we're talking about has developed later on in capitalism, like as you're saying, kind of in a neoliberal mode, that we don't have to be forced to use it, right? We're in this kind of commodity consumer based culture now. So it's like given to us as this idea of ease and luxury, or even enjoyment and pleasure. And then that is how we get seduced into using it. And that's why I think the process of invisibilization works so well, because we think that we're using this as a choice, right? That's like one of the kind of, I don't know, bait and switches of capitalism, is to make us think that we have a choice in what we're doing.
Mm. Hmm.
Like you get to choose your job or something. Like here we choose, like, oh, I'm an Apple person, or I'm
Yeah.
a PC person,
Microsoft.
right?
Yeah.
Microsoft. And but really, either way, we're sort of like developing things for them. And I guess that's like one of the ways they talk about social media a lot, right? Because like social media, in its idea, is a means for us to connect, right? That's like the utopian vision of like Mark Zuckerberg behind
Yeah.
Facebook. Like he wants to make the world better by connecting people. But what we're doing when we're using that, which we think is sharing our lives with our loved ones and friends, is actually creating profit for them in this other way that isn't the explicit thing that we think we're doing, right? Through like
Yes.
whatever ads and other kinds of marketing and selling our data and all these things that we don't see going on. So I think that's another interesting way to think about it. And like going to the broken world thinking, that shift of perspective, right? Like it's like, well, we think we're using this thing for one thing, but it's actually doing this other thing. Is there a way then to like repurpose it so that we're
Yeah.
we can have more control over the ways that we're using these things to ends that serve us rather than
Yeah.
them?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I agree. And it's a really hard question. One thing I was thinking about in terms of what you mentioned about like they've made an illusion that we have like a choice in a lot of things. But so I'm moving to PC computers partially because I am interested out of like kind of nerdiness, like learning how to build up my own computers. And you just can't do that with Mac, right? But I'm also interested in using Linux software. I am, with wanting to move to a PC, I am interested in not using Windows, but to try to use Linux, which is, I'm sure some people are familiar with. It's kind of a family of open source Unix-like operating systems, is just kind of an alternative to things like Apple or Windows. I want to move to this, but I essentially can't for two reasons. One is there is a video game online that I really love. I'm not going to mention what it is because it's quite embarrassing. But recently they've done this thing where they have to, because of AI bots infiltrating this like online game, they have had to put in these like kind of these cheating protocols. And I don't admittedly know what that explicitly looks like, but unfortunately somehow they have not made that compatible with Linux. So you can't play that game if you use Linux. And there's a similar thing to this, which is that I am a video editor and do videography and graphic design, and I use Adobe software, which Adobe sucks and is a shitty corporation in a lot of ways. And you can't run Adobe on Linux. And I don't know the history of why that is, but I'm sure there are lots of politics to that. And then, you could say like, okay, why don't I use free and open source software versions of Adobe software, there are a lot of great options and alternatives to these things that I do hope to transfer more onto in the future. Right now, I do get Adobe for free, so that incentivizes me a little bit. But there are a few free open source software alternatives that are actually pretty great and very, very comparable to the features that Adobe has, right? Kdenlive is an example of that instead of Premiere Pro, the video editing software, or even Audacity, I think is a really good audio recording, free open source software for recording and editing audio. But there are some other ones that I use that aren't as great, and one of them is Photoshop. I haven't really enjoyed any of the alternatives. And the other big one is anyone who does motion graphics and animation. After Effects is the industry standard. And there is just really truly no other good options to that. And I think that that's an example that they've that in this idea of holding us hostage, or creating this idea of choices when do we actually really? And when you choose to try and resist these things for whatever reason, we sacrifice other things, right? And I think that is just a political process in itself.
Yeah, I mean, it tends towards this monopolization. And we saw with the intellectual property as it functioned with the vaccine as a recent thing, right? That there's a choice that's made by the corporations to assert intellectual property rights over their technology, like the vaccine, which they're no, we won't allow this to be replicated and reproduced in a way that's actually more conducive to people getting the vaccine and helping or reduce the risks of COVID. And it's the same thing with these kinds of technologies. They make deals, right? So the industry standard probably means that whatever company gets a deal with whatever other company. It's the same way that the prisons run off of this kind of a few corporations giving them the services. There's deals that are struck between these companies. So what I'm thinking when I was listening to this is because when we were planning this discussion, you said you wanted to talk about that phrase about moving fast and breaking things, right?
Yeah, Mark Zuckerberg's kind of iconic phrase. Mark Zuckerberg of Meta is an iconic phrase: "Move fast, break things."
And so that gives us this sense of innovation, right? This is the thing that we were thinking about in technology, and in the essay, the author is talking about how we want to change our perspective from that innovation. But there's even a question to what extent there's actually innovation here, because if all of the information is proprietary and can't be shared, then probably the tendency will be towards crappy things at some point, right? The curve of innovation will go because they're comfortable and can just make the profit, which we've seen also in just Facebook going to Meta. It's just not even interesting to most people at this point. But yeah, so I maybe we can talk a little bit about that. Their concept of breaking things, and then versus the kind of way that we wanted to talk about breaking things.
Totally. Yeah, I was hoping that we would get to that. So one of the ways that I think is a good way to create kind of a distinguishing framework to a radical idea of breakage versus what is essentially kind of a venture capitalist idea of breakage is what Jackson calls a productivist bias. So what he kind of says is that an important thing to think about is that there actually is kind of this secret history of breakdown and maintenance that has always sustained, but obviously kind of invisibly, these what he describes as higher profile stories of exploration, empire, conquest, and globalization. And I think with an example of big tech in Silicon Valley, so much of what they work on when they worked off of is this idea of breaking things to create something new. I think that the other component of it that's really important is when he says move fast. What does that mean? He tries to push kind of breaking the boundaries to create something more important. And I do think that that's a really interesting juxtaposition to when someone could argue for this idea of just breaking things, which is that I don't think it's that simple as just leaving it at breakage. I think it's about also care, right? It's a politics of care, and it's a politics of intentionality, and a politic of what does it mean to embrace slowness too, right? Because I think that how Mark Zuckerberg said it, and I'm looking at an article on just Business Insider, which is that when he says move fast, break things, he wants people to act with urgency and not waiting till next week to do something you could today. So that for me, I think really is a good way to sum up this idea of productivity, this productivity bias, that we have to be innovating things as quick as possible, and that we're going to innovate even more technologies to make things even more quicker and easier, right? We're seeing this so glaringly with AI and OpenAI. The company has created ChatGPT. People have deeply, deeply embraced it as kind of this like personal assistant, right? You'll just be able to do things quicker. But with that quickness, what is lost, right? What are we not seeing?
But yeah, the break things, right? Like there's this idea of the urgency of making things new, but like I hear that and I'm like, oh, the breaking things is like breaking the lives of the people who like it chews
Yeah.
up, right? Because like at some point because it's a for-profit system of developing technology, these things change from a concept of something that supposedly is supposed to help the world to a way to just continue to make profit. And so they will like lay tons and tons of people off at any moment that they need to. It just churns through like humans as, I don't know, whatever. We're just like fed to this machine. But I like this perspective of care because I mean this is like the also from my like feminist brain that there's this invisibilized idea of like how things are actually like how they actually work, and that they work by like the things that we do that enable them to continue to work, which is like the kind of care work that gets invisibilized. One of the things like in reading this essay though that I was thinking about is like when he changes the perspective to repair as a form of care, right, in the relationship to these broken things. This is my anarchist question, is like to what extent do we want to fix things that will continue to reproduce this world, right?
Yeah.
Like, isn't there something to be desired in the breakdown of these things? Like, you know, he talks about the infrastructure breakdown, you know, the fact that the sort of climate is breaking down is another thing, right? There's going to be more and more ways that all of the things that we've rely on, which purportedly provided for us by the state, are things that aren't going to be there, right? They're going to fall into disrepair. And so I don't know, is our work to repair the things that like are these tools of power over us? And I guess my question for you in terms of technology is like, how do you see us relating to that in a kind of liberatory way?
Yeah. I mean, for me, I really think that like I can't parse out. I think that there is danger in focusing solely on just breakage, just maintenance, just repair, right? I think that what feels more liberatory is creating attention and awareness to all of these three things and how they work both in tandem to each other or how they might contrast each other, right? That we choose these moments, we have the kind of autonomy to figure out how we balance those three things, right? Because I think that one of the problems is that those three things have become so invisible, right? And I think that there is some power in just drawing attention to it. And yeah, you're right. Like I think that there are moments where there is times to break something where the idea is not to make something better that was based off of that original thing, but it's to create something completely new or to completely abolish it, right? But my personal politics is that like, I think to assume that that is the way to go about every single thing is more limited, right? Instead, I think about like, how do we negotiate the lines of when we maintain something, when we choose not to? When do we return to something that has been decaying for a while and then maintaining it then? Or when do we fully break something and take care of what happened after that breakage without focusing on building something else, right? And I think that Facebook is the idea of care is not important to them. Their idea of it's not. I mean, it's not about it's not about quality. It's about scalability. It's about connecting you with as many people as possible and keeping you on their platform, right? It's not about finding a more ethical way of engaging with that. So I think that, you know, I'm very opposed to any type of techno-utopianism. I think that is a logic that has like deeply embedded in neoliberal colonialist logic and just venture capitalism of Silicon Valley. But I will say that I'm not a techno-nihilist. I'm not necessarily even a nihilist in general, or maybe I'm a posi-nihilist. And in that saying that I do really reject any type of like what we need to do is just not use any technology ever, which I think that is pretty negligent. And I think it doesn't put into consideration a lot of different things. I'm going to bother some primitivist that's going to be listening to this right now.
Well, if they're listening to it on their iPhone or something like that. Yeah. But I mean, that's like that annoying meme about like, oh, and you criticize the society and yet you live in it. But I mean, those technology critiques, then we kind of get into the absurd where it's like, oh, like spoons are a technology and like a sign of domestication, and we must reject our spoon.
It goes to a really weird, you can really go down a crazy rabbit hole. But I think the way that I then reject the opposite of that, which we've talked about a lot, is like giving up and giving in. I think that is cowardly and not like revolutionary, and just not the way that I like going about the world. As the thing I love quoting is, being a nihilist doesn't make me want to stay alive more than I already don't. So I do really hold on to this idea of being kind of critical in how I engage with changes in lifestyle. But I think one of the things I think about is like, when I critique big tech, right? And I critique that power structure or technologies, or let's maybe be more specific. When we critique social media, right? I know that my basic go-to is like, I fucking hate social media. I absolutely hate it. But why do we hate it? Like, what are the reasons for that? There's going to be a lot of reasons for that. But one of the things I hate is just doom scrolling. I hate how I get sucked into this fast moving content that is just mindless. And then I hate getting into moments where I feel like I'm experiencing FOMO, or like feeling insecure, looking at other people's bodies, or like so much of it has to do with that. I feel like I'm addicted to it. Like I feel stuck to it. Right. Mm-hmm. But I'm curious. I think that there is importance in breaking down, why is that happening? Right. Is it actually just the idea of social media? Like the idea of like connecting with people through the internet on a website that's like based around interacting with others? Or is it how Facebook and their monopolist modes of existing have designed technologies within that system to create it addictive, right? To create it to be more harmful to kids, to cyberbullying, to so many things. And I think that that's important to interrogate that.
Now it's time for a break. Back to the show. So I think about this in a few ways. And so I think we need to distinguish a couple things, because like we're talking about technology, and now we're focusing mostly on like particular forms of technology and how it's developed in social media through like corporate technology, which like you could probably look at those things like whatever, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, as not super purposeful in this life, right? They're like sort of entertainment things, but I see it through the kind of idea of like the spectacle or like a simulation, right? Like more and more of the way that technological innovation is going in the kind of consumer world is like replicating a life and kind of giving us the feeling of like living in this other like representational realm. I think it connects also to like how most of the work that we do is totally unnecessary work, right? Like the kind of bullshit jobs thing. Like, so like our work and our entertainment is all participating in this non-world, which I think is probably why a lot of it feels so terrible, because it's not like there's nothing tangible in it most of the time. But on the other hand, since it is like representation of something that is real, like I think about like, so like networks from an anarchist point of view have been super important historically, and they didn't need this kind of technology to work, right? Like, as a punk from the 90s, I relied on zines and like mail to connect to people, but we'd have ways of being like how the punks could contact each other, and then if you were traveling, you like know where the places are and how to get in touch with people. And obviously I think like all kind of subcultures, countercultures have created this kind of thing, right? Where there is a social network that exists in a way that's not necessarily proprietary. Maybe it relies on the mail system, which is another thing, but
it's alternative networks, right? Like there's ways that we've created alternative networks. Producing zines is an alternative network, right?
It's technology too.
Yeah, exactly. I do think this goes into that, like, I don't like the idea of conflating the internet with big tech, right? Like there are alternatives to these things that I think have a lot of potential, and I have witnessed and experienced them being just better for me and my mental health, right? Some people might be familiar with this thing called the Fediverse, which is an alternative social media network of almost exclusively free and open source software, where the data is decentralized and there's significantly more opportunities to have more control on how content is moderated, all these things, right? And it's not to say that the Fediverse doesn't have a boatload of issues. There's a lot of things to be said about it. But how I engage on Mastodon, which is the microblogging platform on it, feels significantly different than when I go on Instagram. One of the biggest things is that there's multiple ways that you can look at your like timeline of how people make posts. One of the ways primary ways is that it's chronological, right? That's not how Instagram is. Instagram is showing you, or Meta, or even X, Twitter, or whatever. They're showing you things that are being the most liked, right? Instead of seeing things chronologically. And when I see things chronologically, I don't feel as addicted to it. I don't feel like I feel like there's like a beginning to what I'm scrolling, and then there's an end. Right. And that's just my personal experience. But I think that there is just mountains of evidence, mountains of quantitative and qualitative evidence that the product of why there is, booming hate speech, booming, misinformation, deep psychological depression, and rampant disordered eating issues, cyberbullying, has a lot to do with how these platforms are designed, rather than solely thinking about it that purely a website is the product of that.
I think this is also like going back to the kind of study of technology and how it's embedded in our society, that the kind of mythology or ideology of science is that these things are like created in a neutral way, like the tool has a neutral being, but the ideologies of the dominant world are embedded within them, right? Like how they can say like there's like always bias in like in AI is like just reproducing white supremacy or whatever. And so that's why there has to be this idea, I guess, if we're going to fuck with technology, of a kind of maybe a politicized technology, or like how would you do an anarcho-feminist, trans anarcho-feminist technology, like if we were to make things that don't reproduce the world in this terrible way. That's where I want to go back to the kind of like nihilistic sense, because like it to me is like relating to the negation of this world. And so this is where I get like things feel tricky for me also, as someone who's like chronically ill and dependent on the current state of infrastructure to like live. It's very connected to my sense of life that like I can get this kind of medicine, but like dialing it down a little bit, like creating alternative social networks, it's still reliant on this current infrastructure, even if we're not using Facebook or Instagram, but on the Fediverse, we're reliant on the grid, right? We're reliant on all of these things that are like part of the colonial civilization that exists.
Yeah. That's where I get into that, like that logic just feels like a stalemate, because we just can go down that rabbit hole to like the end of time.
No, but that's why I want to go to this other point that you were saying, because I think so the breakdown, making things visible. And you said a little bit earlier, like in that moment of breakdown, that's when we get to see things and make a choice, right? Because otherwise the seamless use of things, it kind of fades into our lives and we don't necessarily ask questions. We get so used to things working well and having things instantaneously that we even get fucking frustrated when it's like slightly slow. Like, so when things break down, then we can have a choice, right? What we're going to do, how we're going to purpose it. And I actually think about that in terms of relationships too. Like knowing that you can end a relationship at any moment, like allows you to reconsider how you engage in it, because it's not necessary, it's not inevitable. So how can we then think about the ways that we use these things, which are in some way embedded in the world that is as it exists, which is terrible, but we can't also just like pretend there's no purity, we can't like live outside of that in some way. So we need to like relate to these different tools in a way that could possibly be used towards our own ends.
Yeah. And I agree that I think it's about intentionality. And I think it's about like not having some self-righteous idea that you need to do. It's, kind of the same thing with environmentalism, thinking that like some people are just doing it more this like purist way. I don't think we can do the same thing with technology, right? But I do believe that part of our resistance is intentionally trying to break things down in terms of how we interrogate things, or how we actually physically engage with things that can become liberatory or just forms of harm reduction, right? Like me, I still have an Instagram account, but I have truly broken the addiction that I have to it, more or less, right? But I used to have something where I couldn't fathom not going on Facebook or Instagram every single day, to that like I check it I might have moments where I'm kind of going on it a bit more, but I will take 5 months off of not checking it, or just 2 weeks. And that's me breaking away from something that they don't want me to do. They want me to rely on that, right? But it's also not me creating a lump sum of it. But at the same time, I do think that there are also opportunities where you can fully break away from a specific platform or specific thing, right? Like I now don't use, I have a Gmail account because some people will sometimes send me a Google Doc that I need access to, right? Because that's become kind of the primary way. But right now in my life, I have completely switched to Proton Mail, Rise Up, which is an anarchist email service, to also using Disroot, because it provides me, in terms of my email client, the same services. I'm not losing anything different from, in fact, in some ways, I feel like some of those features of those email addresses actually provide me more. So the other thing I think of is that, like, similar to how I want us to negotiate when we maintain something, when we repair, when we break something, I think that there's just like a myriad of ways that we can engage with that technology in big tech. And, and I would think even, right, like I hear a lot of people who are very critical of have no interest in moving to the Fediverse at all. But the majority of us all talk on Signal, right? Like that has provided us, like we have made that collective cultural change ourselves, a lot of it for security reasons. And alternative social media provides a bit more security and safety precautions in the real time. It's not just about like an ideological change. It actually like provides some material benefits that these different platforms don't. Right. And so I do think that there is possibilities to know that we can always use and participate in alternative infrastructures without thinking that we're going to, like, just because it's just safer or just more beneficial to us right now in this moment, rather than idealizing it in a broader thing that we somehow are going to be able to topple over Silicon Valley, because quite frankly, I don't think that will happen unless it was a destruction of the Western world as we know it.
Yeah, there's a way that the sort of these alternatives, though, as sort of safety measures, I think can also lull us into like this kind of seamless integration of the alternative tech, right? Like we use Signal, and so then we're safer, but like we know that that's not foolproof, right? That Signal can be accessed through phones, and that you should still not use it to say things that you don't want to hear in court or whatever. So I think like maybe this like breakdown perspective can make us take that kind of vantage point when we're using these things. I mean, like, let's think about when we use this, how it would be when it doesn't work the way that it's supposed to work,
And we need to also change. There needs to be a drastic change in, like, when I like boost the Fediverse, which I am very pro and encourage people to move to. The Fediverse is still social media. It is not where you organize things, right? And I think that we still work under a logic, Facebook so deeply valorized the Arab Spring uprising, right? In like 2011. And you read so much about it and how social media just transformed the Arab Spring. It's how we know it today. People talk about with the Occupy or like the Ignados movement, or like anti-austerity movements in Europe during that time. But that we have very much changed from that time period to now. So we need to break down and challenge how we think about using technology to organize things, right? But we have come to learn those things through how our illusion of these platforms became damaging to our communities, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's interesting now too, because of the way that the genocide in Gaza has been amplified, or the information around it has been amplified through social media. And then we see like these companies trying to silence people in all these ways, or like shadow ban and all this thing. Like it's again, it shows us the way, like the breakdown there where you're like shadow banned or like these, we can see them deleting this kinds of information. That's like a place where we can see the power at work in these things that we're using. And I think that we have to consider that, like, living in this world, how do we mess with what is there and available to us to our own purposes without feeling like we're necessarily safe at all these times.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a fear in my mind of like the increase of the kind of surveillance aspect of these things.
Oh, big time.
As they're trying to introduce, like, you like won't be able to fly at some point without scanning your face. And I don't know if they start doing that on like the subways or something. I don't know. Right. I'm here in New York where they just are deploying the National Guard and extra cops into the subways to do bag checks for some unknown reason, that like all these kind of ways that the securitization of the state operates through these technologies, and these companies share all that information with them and the militaries. So,
Yeah. I mean, big tech is completely embedded within the surveillance of those platforms is enmeshed with the surveillance system of corporations. The surveillance system of these corporations and these platforms that we often have most likely been seeing them as kind of a singular entity is a fallacy. They are all deeply enmeshed in states and nations. Right.
Maybe this like breakdown perspective can also help us think, because, okay, so some of the ways that that works is like the kind of Foucauldian panopticon, or like, I guess, a Bentham, the idea of the panopticon that the possibility of constant surveillance, it doesn't actually need to have someone watching you all the time for it to work as a kind of self-policing. And so there's ways that these systems and technologies present themselves as totalizing, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, that's like the dream of the metaverse, I think, was to like replace reality with Mark
Yeah.
Zuckerberg's corporate entity. But they aren't total, right? These things
Yeah.
aren't total, and the state's control over us isn't total. It's actually diffuse in all these like weird places, and there are places of breakdown, and there are places of escape, and there's places to like move between things. And so I think that perspective is helpful, because if we are going to use these tools which aren't fully in our hands, how do we maximize the cracks of where we can kind of deviate them from the purposes of like surveillance and profit generation?
Yeah. I mean, by people getting off and even just using certain platforms less, we are providing them less data, right? I do think that there is like material implications to these things, right? There's like material harms, and there's like material ways that we can like just minutely mitigate those harms, even if it's just for ourselves, right? Like purely the fact, as someone who has experienced online harassment and like longstanding doxing campaigns, me getting off Instagram, and or even before that, making my Instagram private, which unfortunately it was not, taking off a lot of information off of different platforms, significantly reduced the online harassment campaign that like neo-Nazis were putting against me, right? Like that also paused ways that my friends were getting in trouble or harassed too, right? And I will say that like some of it for me is also, it's also just some moral opinions I have, like learning about Amazon and Google's Project Nimbus, which is like, Google and Amazon are providing cloud services to Israel to build up their artificial intelligence surveillance technologies that are murdering Palestinians, is just hard for me to think about using those sites in these specific moments. It's just my conscience. Like, it's just really hard for me to think about how they are actually serving the infrastructure for how they are creating automated weapons, right? Or how large language model AI technology is providing ways that like military services are looking at how they can use things like ChatGPT to expedite and create more productive ways to create other models, artificial intelligence, like automated weapons. Like, that's whether or not I think my choice in using these things or not is not going to change that. But it is hard for me those things are so deeply traumatizing for me to think about, or like mortifying, that like in this moment, I just can't get myself to want to continue to like use or buy more space on my Google Drive when Google is doing that. It's just my own personal thing, but I do think it's like worth mentioning.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to go back into my tech pessimism or tech nihilism. So like maybe the technological utopia is really embodied by Israel, right? As this place that has like developed and attempted to perfect total control over the movement of bodies in its imposition of like apartheid and the siege on Gaza, and now this like escalation of genocide. Mbembe wrote about this in his essay on necropolitics, just like the kind of division of the space in the ways that it's monitored. So like the actual utopian desire behind a lot of this technology, it aligns with that kind of totalitarian wish, which is to be able to know where everyone is at any moment in order to have total control, right? Mm-hmm. And I do think that that's just like, there's ways that that's not possible, that life always escapes that kind of total control or total surveillance. And if it does work, all it does do is create death. But yeah, I don't know. I guess that's where I'm just like, in some point, I feel like we get so caught up in this. Like, I think about how, because we're so attached to these technologies, that there's a certain form of kind of politics or activism or organizing or whatever that just becomes like everyone has to make a statement anytime anything happens on their like Twitter or
Oh
their
yeah,
Instagram, right? I mean, the thing
totally.
that really pissed me off was when Aaron Bushnell lit himself on fire in front of the Israeli embassy, was that everyone thought they had to like say something about it, and like he was saying something, right? He wasn't asking us to sit in judgment over whether it was right or wrong. But that, I think that a lot of people, that like kind of hot take machine has
Yes,
substituted for politics. It's part of that kind of
100%.
spectacle, right? That
Yeah.
we like think we're doing something through saying stuff. And I fall guilty to this because like the thing that I feel like I'm good at and that I do is like talking about things and thinking about things and writing about things, which is
Yeah.
very different from action, right? It's not the
Yeah.
same thing as action.
Well, I mean, that's complicated. I will continue. I get what you're saying, but I also don't think you should cut yourself that short.
No, I mean I have contributions to make in these ways, but like they don't take the place of action, and they don't
Yeah.
take the place of like destroying this world in other in very direct ways. Like I want to set the place for us to refuse this world, but that refusal needs to happen in the real world, not
But
online world, you know?
But that refusal needs to, how we create those things in the moment is alternative infrastructures, right? Like we break things down to find something new in the meantime. Like we find ways of care for ourselves and maintain our communities through finding ways to sabotage, opt out. Like if we don't really have any way to like swing the pendulum over to creating a refusal and a destruction of society if we don't find ways to create and maintain ourselves to do so in the meantime.
Yeah, and I just like had this funny thought that like to perform sabotage, we need the machine, right? If sabotage is the thing we want to do, we want to throw our shoes in the works of the machine. We need the machine to be able to do that. And so in a way, these kinds of this is another form of my kind of nihilistic thinking, is that a lot of the ways that we like directly confront these systems is in some way signing on to these systems existing, because we like, you know, when you have a power of a battle with power and direct confrontation, you're caught up in that power system itself. I mean, it's that sort of like annoying Foucauldian idea that like power already anticipates resistance, which feels like it ends up folding us into it. But this like breakdown theory, I think, is very interesting in the ways that you're talking about, because, right, so if it takes our attention away from innovation, right, this also, when if we want to like translate this into anarchism, right,
Yeah.
take our attention away from the idea of revolution, because revolution is often framed as a kind of innovation, right? Like something new will happen that will change how everything works, right? Like this idea of
Mm-hmm.
like, you know, we're gonna have a revolution and we'll replace this shit world with a free world. And
Yeah.
we don't know how that'll happen, but we're trying to do the things that'll make it happen. But
Mm-hmm.
if we switch away the breakdown theory, which is like messing around with what is through an ethics of repair and care to potentially repurpose things that exist towards other ends, and then refuse the things that we can't, you know, salvage
Yeah.
in any way. I mean, this is like, yeah, the alternative infrastructure, the forms of counter power, the ways that we can use the tools that in our hands right now to build a different world while we're still living in the hell world that
Yeah.
exists.
And you know, like, yeah, exactly. Like, I think that that's just like, also just like, it's a life, you know, it's a value and lifestyle anarchism, right? Like, I also like the idea of creating disarray just for disarray's sake. And there are plenty of hackers and political hackers that like do that. And I think that that is really cool in a lot of ways. Or like, I think the piracy movement is like, and like copyleft movement are just, they're just like ways of challenging things just for the sake of that. Because I feel like playing I feel like playing the Sims game without paying for the horrible prices, insane prices that they have to play that game, right?
Yeah, there's the possibility of like gumming up the works through their
Yeah.
tools. I mean, I was talking with a longtime sort of activist who has brought up this thing like there's always the time in the meeting. Like it used to be that you would be like, okay, then we need to like get a helicopter, right? And then we'll make a getaway with a helicopter. And then she was like, well, now it's like now then we need to get some hackers to like do a thing, right? And these are both fantasies of technology creating liberation, right? Have the helicopter, we can like get the prison break and get people away, right? Or whatever. We'll hack, we'll like tear down their infrastructure and be able to get free, or like whatever it is. And I think that like we do have to really counter that thinking, because those tools aren't our means of liberation. They could be places where we actively work towards breaking down or even breaking through. But, you know, it seems often that the like more successful sort of attacks on empire have been the low tech ones, not the high tech ones. Like what we saw with Hamas and the Al-Aqsa front, or, you know, even going back to like the Vietnamese guerrilla war against the US. It's usually the sort of low tech things that break through, maybe in way because some of this like high tech stuff is designed to maintain empire. So I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm thinking this is again like the fantasies that we have, or how we're going to bring the rev. And to me, this also like, you know, I've really been trying to rethink this kind of desire we have to directly confront power through massive politics, which I don't know. I wonder to what extent that also plays into the hands of the kind of surveillance state. And then we meet them on their own turf where they can totally dominate us, you know?
Yeah. One thing I want to return to is Jackson's idea of the broken world thinking, which is challenging a binary idea between like technology evil, technology utopic, right? You know, what like in terms of like thinking about technology, using these technologies is hacking, or still using the system, which I think I do disagree with to an extent, because also hacking it's a practice, and I don't know if I think that the internet is inherently problematic. So what he says is that, and I'll just share this like quote explicit, like as it is that while it's true that different technologies emerge from and instantiate different regimes of maintenance and repair, the form of broken world thinking that's advocated in this article rejects the idea of making this the basis for large-scale distinctions between, for example, modern and pre-modern technologies. And I think I just go back to this idea of like, I don't think it is useful to keep going back and forth into thinking like, well, we can't like this thing that I feel like I regularly go into in terms of like, no type of action is possible because we're still working the thing, to them being like, we must be doing all these things possible, when I just think that it is so nuanced for how it's also speculative too, right? Like we really don't know. And like, I think that so much of it comes from experimenting and strategizing a diversity of ways in engaging with these things, while also revoking any self-righteousness to this, right? I think that the idea is that like none of us really know until we do it. And just the same way that SDS or broken world thinking is pushing us to not see technology as like the innovator, the person who failed, or like this is the person who's making the technology, this is the person who's receiving it or like using it, is like looking at the cracks like in between those things. You know, we're not just seeing something as sender receiver, as like this is the dominant regime, you know, producer, and this is not. You know, I even think that like the panopticon model of surveillance has been really problematized and challenged now. I don't think it's that. I think that surveillance is like significantly more nuanced than that. But I feel drawn to broken world thinking insofar that I want to challenge this like, well, nothing's going to do anything. Well, no, it's still important to do it. It's like, what if it's just both and? Like, what if we just can't really ever know? Like, what if we can't really provide the answer to like what is revolutionary or what is not? And is that we're just going to get into stalemate arguments?
Yeah, no, I think there's a tendency often in ways that we talk about things to simplify them in a way and abstract ideas that loses the texture of them, right? Like,
yeah.
And to me, that is a kind of what I call like a state logic, that we like think that things are one way or another way, and then that obscures all the mess in between. And part of the idea in the broken world thinking, I think, is like a kind of against this myth of progress, because there's this idea that like technology is in a linear development, right? Where like from one moment to another, it's a new development that furthers technology, that is like leading us somewhere, right? I don't know, whatever it is, this idea of like some kind of culmination of human development, or to the singularity, or whatever the fuck it is. But like if we conceptualize technology not as progress, right? And maybe there isn't something fundamental, like you said, not distinguishing between modern and pre-modern. Maybe there's not something fundamentally different between the technology that we use today and technology that like people used however 1,000 years ago, right? That there's like continuity between these things, because we're using, like, we create tools that often are some sort of like prosthetic aspect of like our own capacities to amplify them in some way that serves to make things like easier for us somehow. And so to like kind of getting outside of this progress mentality, because that's the mentality also that, like, going back to the beginning of our conversation, is like, when we adopt a technology, then we can't imagine life without it, right? And I
Yeah.
think that really sticks our thinking. To me, that's like one of the fundamental flaws in the kind of Marxist understanding, which is like that it makes industrial development sort of necessary for the realization of communism, right? And a kind of
Mm-hmm.
like we need to go through it to get to, we need to go through this stage to get to the next stage. And I think I want to not think about things as being necessary,
Yeah.
necessarily this way to get to the next thing.
Yeah. Yes,
Um,
totally.
and then so then we can again, like you were saying, like when instead of just like saying, oh, I can't imagine a world now without like email or whatever the
Mhm.
hell it is, internet, because like we couldn't go back there. We're like, no, like this stuff is only doing something for us that we allow it to do, and then we
Yes. Yeah.
decide what we allow it to do and what we
Yeah.
don't allow it to do. But I
Yeah.
do think, I mean, at some point, like we do have to really consider the false comforts that these things bribe us with,
Yeah.
which again,
Totally.
I'm not exempting myself from this.
No, me neither. I mean, as someone who's very passionate about this, like I'm on a Mac computer, but I think that the more that we break down these invisible barriers or break down the politics of technology, which is so deeply hidden, the more that we can find our own ways of choosing how we want to break down things more or how we want to repair something or fix something up. And I think there's more ways that we can like share those tools with each other, like not everyone is going to be a computer nerd, right? Like that's not for everyone. And the same way though that not everyone's going to be like good at car maintenance, right? Like I made a decision a while ago that my brain does not feel right for like knowing all the ins and outs of fixing my car, and that like it's something, I made the decision to do that or like have thought about it, right? That the same way that like some people might really struggle with figuring out how to set certain different things up on your computer, but like, what does it look like if some of us who are more tech savvy can be like, yeah, I'll do that for you. Like I will help you. I will use my resources to help my other friends do this, right?
Yeah, that's become part of like the sort of organizing, right? We have our
Yeah.
medics, we have like the people who do food distro, and we have the
Yeah.
people who know how to like use computers. But I mean, some of the problems with the way that technology is like whatever, I don't know what I exactly mean when I'm saying technology, but like this kind of big tech or the like intellectual property form of technology that makes it so that you can't do DIY stuff. It creates a sort of professionalization or a mastery that's necessary to use it. And like what if we could like reframe all of this from an amateur perspective, that like
Yeah, which is me. I don't know. I am not a technologist, right? I mean, like I study it and I like writing about it and I have some skills on it, a little bit more than some other people, but I don't know Python code, which is a pretty basic thing that a lot of people would know if you are getting into software development. I know very, very little of it, but could we embrace some amateur ways of engaging with this?
And this would be another form of resource sharing, that like people share the knowledge of like how to use these things so we don't get used by them, basically.
Yeah, there's a cool. So I don't know if you're familiar with Iffy Books. That is in.
I was actually thinking about them while you were talking.
So I'm a big fan of Iffy Books. If you live in Philadelphia, you should absolutely go there. You should check out their website. But they have a lot of series of workshops, and one of them that really struck me that I thought was so cool was this workshop for parents who can learn how to make toys of their kids quieter. So if people who work at home are just really annoyed with really loud toys that they have, they're teaching you how to break into those toys to just make them quieter for yourself. And I think that is like a very cool example of like, what does it mean to engage with this sense of like care and breakage at the same time?
Yeah, they also do like lock picking classes, which I think is like another thing that's a way to think about technology, because like locks are a technology, right?
Yeah.
And there's like ways that they work, and maybe it's not the broken world thinking. Like,
I mean, I think it is. I think it absolutely is. You're breaking down something that's meant to not be undone. Right.
There's a replication of some of the ways that these tools work and technology works, so that learning like some of these things, well, we can kind of like learning small steps can be mapped onto other things, because there's repetition of the forms that are used. There's like only a sort of small repertoire of like of things that people can actually do. Is there anything else that we want to make sure we cover?
No, I think this was cool. I'm just glad. Thanks for having me on this. I think this is really cool, and I'm glad. Thank you for inviting me to talk.
Yeah, no, I mean, I thought it was a really interesting thing. I wrote down this too. I like
Okay.
maybe this would be a way to kind of end it, because like
Yeah.
I wrote, the system is built such that we think breakdown is disastrous, but the system itself is disastrous. So then can we then think about breakdown as not the disaster, but the opportunity to like reframe it?
Yeah, I love that. I really like that. And I think it goes into this other thing that I had mentioned about like not putting breakage and repair and maintenance and care like in opposition to each other.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Well, yeah. Thank
Yeah.
you for bringing this conversation to me and having it and spending time with me talking
Yeah.
about it.
I love you so much.
Love you too.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to The Breakup Theory. You can follow us on Patreon at The Breakup Theory, or rate and follow us anywhere you get podcasts. Call us at 917-426-6548 or share your story at forum.jotform.com/thebreakuptheory/stories. Can't wait to hear from you. Till next time.